The Cybrarian presents Robert E. Howard's Cull, the Conqueror. In the time of Bran Mak Morn, Kings of the Night. Disclaimer: the following may contain violence, references to sex, and language that may offend. Part 3. And the two wild peoples of the north stood fronting in the gloam, and heard and knew each in his mind a third great sound upon the wind, the living walls that hedge mankind, the walking walls of Rome. Chesterton. The sun slanted westward. Silence lay like an invisible mist over the valley. Cormac gathered the reins in his hand and glanced up at the ridges on both sides. The waving heather which grew rank on those steep slopes gave no evidence of the hundreds of savage warriors who lurked there. Here in the narrow gorge, which widened gradually southward, was the only sign of life. Between the steep walls, 300 Northmen were massed, solidly, in their wedge-shaped shield wall, blocking the pass. At the tip, like the point of a spear, stood the man who called himself Cull, King of Valusia. He wore no helmet, only the great, strangely worked headband of hard gold. But he bore on his left arm the great shield borne by the dead Ragnar, and in his right hand he held the heavy iron mace wielded by the Sea King. The Vikings eyed him in wonder and savage admiration. They could not understand his language, or he theirs, but no further orders were necessary. At Bran's directions, they had bunched themselves in the gorge, and their only order was, hold the pass. Bran Mak Morn stood just in front of Cull. So they faced each other, he whose kingdom was yet unborn, and he whose kingdom had been lost in the mists of time for unguessed ages. Kings of darkness, thought Cormac, nameless kings of the night, whose realms are gulfs and shadows. The hand of the Pictish king went out. King Cull, you are more than king. You are a man. Both of us may fall within the next hour. But if we both live, ask what you will of me. Cull smiled, returning the firm grip. You two are a man after my own heart, King of the Shadows. Surely you are more than a figment of my sleeping imagination. Mayhap we will meet in the waking life some day. Bran shook his head in puzzlement, swung into the saddle and rode away, climbing the eastern slope and vanishing over the ridge. Cormac hesitated. Strange man. Are you in truth of flesh and blood, or are you a ghost? When we dream, We are all flesh and blood. So long as we are dreaming, Cull answered. This is the strangest nightmare I have ever known. But you, who will soon fade into sheer nothingness as I awaken, seem as real to me now as Brule, or Carnu, or Tu, or Kelkor. Cormac shook his head, as Bran had done, and with a last salute, which Cull returned with barbaric stateliness, he turned and trotted away. At the top of the western ridge he paused. Away to the south, a light cloud of dust rose, and the head of the marching column was in sight. Already he believed he could feel the earth vibrate slightly, to the measured tread of 1,000 mailed feet, beating in perfect unison. He dismounted, and one of his chieftains, Domhnall, took his steed and led it down the slope away from the valley, where trees grew thickly. Only an occasional vague movement among them gave evidence of the 500 men who stood there, each at his horse's head, with a ready hand to check a chance nicker. Oh, thought Cormac, the gods themselves made this valley for Bran's ambush. The floor of the valley was treeless, and the inner slopes were bare save for the waist-high heather. But at the foot of each ridge, on the side facing away from the vale, where the soil long washed from the rocky slopes had accumulated, there grew enough trees to hide 500 horsemen, or 50 chariots. At the northern end of the valley stood Cull and his 300 Vikings, in open view, flanked on each side by 50 Pictish bowmen. Hidden on the western side of the western ridge were the Gaels. Along the top of the slopes, concealed in the tall heather, lay 100 Picts with their shafts on strings. The rest of the Picts were hidden on the eastern slopes, beyond which lay the Britons, with their chariots in full readiness. Neither they nor the Gaels to the west could see what went on in the vale, but signals had been arranged. Now the column was entering the wide mouth of the valley, and their scouts, lightly armed men on swift horses, were spreading out between the slopes. They galloped almost within bowshot of the silent host that blocked the pass, then halted. Some whirled and raced back to the main force, while the others deployed and cantered up the slopes, seeking to see what lay beyond. This was the crucial moment. If they got any hint of the ambush, all was lost. Cormac, shrinking down into the heather, marvelled at the ability of the Picts to efface themselves from view so completely. He saw a horseman pass within 3 feet of where he knew a bowman lay, yet the Roman saw nothing. The scouts topped the ridges, gazed about, then most of them turned and trotted back down the slopes. Cormac wondered at their desultory manner of scouting. He had never fought Romans before, knew nothing of their arrogant self-confidence, of their incredible shrewdness in some ways, their incredible stupidity in others. These men were overconfident, a feeling radiating from their officers. It had been years since a force of Caledonians had stood before the legions, and most of these men were newly come to Britain, part of a legion which had been quartered in Egypt. They despised their foes and suspected nothing. But stay. 3 riders on the opposite ridge had turned and vanished on the other side. And now one, sitting his steed at the crest of the western ridge, not 100 yards from where Cormac lay, looked long and narrowly down into the mass of trees at the foot of the slope. Cormac saw suspicion grow on his brown, hawk-like face. He half-turned, as though to call to his comrades, then instead reined his steed down the slope, leaning forward in his saddle. Cormac's heart pounded. Each moment he expected to see the man wheel and gallop back to raise the alarm. he resisted a mad impulse to leap up and charge the Roman on foot. Surely the man could feel the tenseness in the air, the hundreds of fierce eyes upon him. Now he was halfway down the slope, out of sight of the men in the valley, and now the twang of an unseen bow broke the painful stillness. With a strangled gasp, the Roman flung his hands high, and as the steed reared, he pitched headlong, transfixed by a long, black arrow that had flashed from the heather. A stocky dwarf sprang out of nowhere, seemingly, and seized the bridle, quieting the snorting horse, and leading it down the slope. At the fall of the Roman, short, crooked men rose like a sudden flight of birds from the grass, and Cormac saw the flash of a knife. Then, with an unreal suddenness, all had subsided. Slayers and slain were unseen, and only the still waving heather marked the grim deed. The Gael looked back into the valley. The three who had ridden over the eastern ridge had not come back, and Cormac knew they never would. Evidently, the other scouts had borne word that only a small band of warriors were ready to dispute the passage of the legionaries. Now the head of the column was almost below him, and he thrilled at the sight of these men who were doomed, swinging along with their superb arrogance. And the sight of their splendid armour, their hawk-like faces, and perfect discipline awed him as much as it is possible for a Gael to be awed. 1,200 men in heavy armour, who marched as one, so that the ground shook to their tread. Most of them were middle height, with powerful chests and shoulders and bronzed faces, hard-bitten veterans of 100 campaigns. Cormac noted their javelins, short, keen swords and heavy shields, their gleaming armour and crested helmets, the eagles on the standards. These were men beneath whose tread the world had shaken, and empires crumbled. Not all were Latins. There were Romanized Britons among them, and 1 century or 100 was composed of huge, yellow-haired men, Gauls and Germans, who fought for Rome as fiercely as did the native born, and hated their wilder kinsmen more savagely. On each side was a swarm of cavalry, outriders, and the column was flanked by archers and slingers. A number of lumbering wagons carried the supplies of the army. Cormac saw the commander riding in his place, a tall man with a lean, imperious face, evident even at this distance. Marcus Silvius. The Gaul knew him by reputation. A deep-throated roar rose from the legionaries as they approached their foes. Evidently, they intended to slice their way through and continue without pause, for the column moved implacably on. Whom the gods destroy, they first make mad. Cormac had never heard the phrase, but it came to him that the great Silvius was a fool. Roman arrogance. Marcus was used to lashing the cringing peoples of a decadent East. Little he guessed of the iron in these Western races. A group of cavalry detached itself and raced into the mouth of the gorge. But it was only a gesture. With loud, jeering shouts they wheeled, 3 spears' length away, and cast their javelins, which rattled harmlessly on the overlapping shields of the silent Northmen. But their leader dared too much. Swinging in, he leaned from his saddle and thrust at Cull's face. The great shield turned the lance, and Cull struck back as a snake strikes. The ponderous mace crushed helmet and head like an eggshell, and the very steed went to its knees from the shock of that terrible blow. From the Northmen went up a short, fierce roar, and the Picts behind them howled exultantly and loosed their arrows among the retreating horsemen. First blood for the people of the Heather. The oncoming Romans shouted vengefully and quickened their pace as the frightened horses raced by. A ghastly travesty of a man, foot caught in the stirrup, trailing beneath the pounding hoofs. Now the first line of the legionaries, compressed because of the narrowness of the gorge, crashed against the solid wall of shields, crashed and recoiled upon itself. The shield wall had not shaken an inch. This was the first time the Roman legions had met with that unbreakable formation, that oldest of all Aryan battle lines, the ancestor of the Spartan regiment, the Theban phalanx, the Macedonian formation, the English square. Shield crashed on shield, and the short Roman sword sought for an opening in that iron wall. Viking spears, bristling in solid ranks above, thrust and reddened. Heavy axes chopped down, shearing through iron, flesh and bone. Cormac saw Cull, looming above the stocky Romans in the forefront of the fray, dealing blows like thunderbolts. A burly centurion rushed in, shield held high, stabbing upward. The iron mace crashed terribly, shivering the sword, rending the shield apart, shattering the helmet, crushing the skull down between the shoulders in a single blow. The front line of the Romans bent like a steel bar about the wedge, as the legionaries sought to struggle through the gorge on each side and surround their opposers. But the pass was too narrow. Crouching close against the steep walls, the Picts drove their black arrows in a hail of death. At this range, the heavy shafts tore through shield and corselet, transfixing the armoured men. The front line of battle rolled back, red and broken, and the Northmen trod their few dead underfoot to close the gaps their fall had made. Stretched the full width of their front line lay a thin line of shattered forms, the red spray of the tide which had broken upon them in vain. Cormac had leapt to his feet, waving his arms. Domhnall and his men broke cover at the signal, and came galloping up the slope lining the ridge. Cormac mounted the horse brought him, and glanced impatiently across the narrow vale. No sign of life appeared on the eastern ridge. Where was Bran and the Britons? Down in the valley, the legions, angered at the unexpected opposition of the paltry force in front of them, but not suspicious, were forming in a more compact body. The wagons which had halted were lumbering on again, and the whole column was once more in motion as if it intended to crash through by sheer weight. With the Gaulish century in the forefront, the legionaries were advancing again in the attack, this time with the full force of 1,200 men behind. The charge would batter down the resistance of Cull's warriors like a heavy ram, would stamp them down, sweep over their red ruins. Cormac's men trembled in impatience. Suddenly Marcus Silvius turned and gazed westward, where the line of horsemen was etched against the sky. Even at that distance, Cormac saw his face pale. The Roman at last realised the mettle of the men he faced, and that he had walked into a trap. Surely in that moment there flashed a chaotic picture through his brain. Defeat, disgrace, red ruin. It was too late to retreat, too late to form into a defensive square with the wagons for barricade. There was but one possible way out, and Marcus, crafty general in spite of his recent blunder, took it. Cormac heard his voice cut like a clarion through the din, and though he did not understand the words, he knew that the Roman was shouting for his men to smite that knot of Northmen like a blast, to hack their way through and out of the trap before it could close. Now the legionaries, aware of their desperate plight, flung themselves headlong and terribly on their foes. The shield wall rocked, but it gave not an inch. The wild faces of the Gauls and the hard brown Italian faces glared over locked shields into the blazing eyes of the north. Shields touching, they smote and slew and died in a red storm of slaughter, where crimsoned axes rose and fell and dripping spears broke on notched swords. Where in God's name was Bran with his chariots? A few minutes more would spell the doom of every man who held that pass. Already they were falling fast, though they locked their ranks closer and held like iron. Those wild men of the north were dying in their tracks, and looming above their golden heads, the black lion mane of Cull shone like a symbol of slaughter, and his reddened mace showered a ghastly rain as it splashed brains and blood like water. Something snapped in Cormac's brain.
"These men will die while we wait for Bran's signal," he shouted. "On! Follow me into hell! Sons of Gael!"
A wild roar answered him, and loosening rein he shot down the slope with 500 yelling riders plunging headlong after him. And even at that moment, a storm of arrows swept the valley from either side like a dark cloud, and the terrible clamour of the Picts split the skies. And over the eastern ridge, like a sudden burst of rolling thunder on Judgment Day, rushed the war chariots. Headlong down the slope they roared, foam flying from the horses' distended nostrils, frantic feet scarcely seeming to touch the ground, making naught of the tall heather. In the foremost chariot, with his dark eyes blazing, crouched Bran Mak Morn, and in all of them the naked Britons were screaming and lashing as if possessed by demons. Behind the flying chariots came the Picts, howling like wolves and loosing their arrows as they ran. The heather belched them forth from all sides in a dark wave. So much Cormac saw, in chaotic glimpses during that wild ride down the slopes. A wave of cavalry swept between him and the main line of the column. 3 long leaps ahead of his men, the Gaelic princes met the spears of the Roman riders. The first lance turned on his buckler, and rising in his stirrups he smote downward, cleaving his man from shoulder to breastbone. The next Roman flung a javelin that killed Domhnall, but in that instant Cormac's steed crashed into his, breast to breast, and the lighter horse rolled headlong under the shock, flinging his rider beneath the pounding hooves. Then the whole blast of the Gaelic charge smote the Roman cavalry, shattering it, crashing and rolling it down and under. Over its red ruins, Cormac's yelling demons struck the heavy Roman infantry, and the whole line reeled at the shock. Swords and axes flashed up and down, and the force of their rush carried them deep into the massed ranks. Here checked, they swayed and strove. Javelins thrust, swords flashed upwards, bringing down horse and rider, and greatly outnumbered, leaguered on every side. The Gaels had perished among their foes, but at that instant, from the other side, the crashing chariots smote the Roman ranks. In one long line they struck, almost simultaneously, and at the moment of the impact, the charioteers wheeled their horses sidelong and raced parallel down the ranks, shearing men down like the mowing of wheat. Hundreds died on those curving blades in that moment, and leaping from the chariots, screaming like blood-mad wildcats, the British swordsmen flung themselves upon the spears of the legionaries, hacking madly with their 2-handed swords. Crouching, the Picts drove their arrows point blank, and then sprang in to slash and thrust. Maddened with the sight of the victory, these wild people were like wounded tigers, feeling no wounds, and dying on their feet with their last gasp a snarl of fury. But the battle was not over yet. Dazed, shattered, their formation broken and nearly half their number down already. The Romans fought back with desperate fury. Hemmed in on all sides, they slashed and smote singly, or in small clumps. Fought back to back, archers, slingers, horsemen and heavy legionnaires mingled into a chaotic mass. The confusion was complete, but not of victory. Those bottled in the gorge still hurled themselves upon the red axes that barred their way, while the massed and serried battle thundered behind them. From one side, Cormac's Gaels raged and slashed. From the other, chariots swept back and forth, retiring and returning like iron whirlwinds. There was no retreat, for the Picts had flung a cordon across the way they had come, and having cut the throats of the camp followers and possessed themselves of the wagon, they sent their shafts in a storm of death into the rear of the shattered column. Those long black arrows pierced armour and bone, nailing men together. Yet the slaughter was not all on one side. Picts died beneath the lightning thrust of javelin and short sword. Gaels pinned beneath their falling horses were hewed to pieces, and chariots cut loose from their horses were deluged with the blood of the charioteers. And at the narrow head of the valley still the battle surged and eddied. Great gods, thought Cormac, glancing between lightning-like blows. Do these men still hold the gorge? Aye, they held it. A tenth of their original number, dying on their feet, they still held back the frantic charges of the dwindling legionaries. Over all the field went up the roar and clash of arms. And birds of prey, swift flying out of the sunset, circled above. Cormac, striving to reach Marcus Sullius through the press, saw the Roman's horse sink under him, and the rider rise alone in a waste of foes. He saw the Roman sword flash thrice, dealing a death at each blow. Then from the thickest of the fray bounded a terrible figure. It was Bran Mak Morn, stained from head to foot. He cast away his broken sword as he ran, drawing a dirk. The Roman struck, but the Pictish king was under the thrust, and gripping the sword wrist, he drove the dirk again and again through the gleaming armour. A mighty roar went up as Marcus died, and Cormac, with a shout, rallied the remnants of his force about him, and, striking in the spurs, burst through the shattered lines and rode full speed for the other end of the valley. But as he approached, he saw that he was too late. As they had lived, so had they died, those fierce sea-wolves, with their faces to the foe and their broken weapons red in their hands. In a grim and silent band they lay, even in death preserving some of the shield wall formation. Among them, in front of them and all about them, lay high-heaped the bodies of those who had sought to break them, in vain. They had not given back a foot. To the last man, they had died in their tracks, nor were there any left to stride over their torn shapes. Those Romans who had escaped the Vikings' axes had been struck down by the shafts of the Picts and the swords of the Gaels from behind. Yet this part of the battle was not over. High up on the steep western slope, Cormac saw the ending of that drama. A group of Gauls in the armour of Rome pressed upon a single man, a black-haired giant, on whose head gleamed a golden crown. There was iron in these men, as well as in the man who had held them to their fate. They were doomed. Their comrades were being slaughtered behind them, but before their turn came, they would at least have the life of the black-haired chief who had led the golden-haired men of the north. Pressing upon him from three sides, they had forced him slowly back up the steep gorge wall, and the crumpled bodies that stretched along his retreat showed how fiercely every foot of the way had been contested. Here on this steep, It was task enough to keep one's footing alone, yet these men at once climbed and fought. Cull's shield and the huge mace were gone, and the great sword in his right hand was dyed crimson. His mail, wrought with a forgotten art, now hung in shreds, and the blood steamed from 100 wounds on limbs, head, and body. But his eyes still blazed with the battle joy, and his wearied arm still drove the mighty blade in strokes of death. But Cormac saw that the end would come before they could reach him. Now at the very crest of the steep, a hedge of points menaced the strange king's life, and even his iron strength was ebbing. Now he split the skull of a huge warrior, and the backstroke shore through the neck cords of another. Reeling under a very rain of swords, he struck again, and his victim dropped at his feet, cleft to the breastbone. Then, even as a dozen swords rose above the staggering Atlantean for the death stroke, a strange thing happened. The sun was sinking into the western sea. All the heather swam red like an ocean of blood. Etched in the dying sun, as he had first appeared, Cull stood, and then, like a mist lifting, a mighty vista opened behind the reeling king. Cormac's astounded eyes caught a fleeting, gigantic glimpse of other climes and spheres. As if mirrored in summer clouds, he saw, instead of the heather hills stretching away to the sea, a dim and mighty land of blue mountains and gleaming, quiet lakes. The golden, purple and sapphirine spires and towering walls of a mighty city, such as the earth had not known for many a drifting age. Then, like the fading of a mirage, it was gone. But the Gauls on the high slope had dropped their weapons and stared like dazed men, for the man called Cull had vanished, and there was no trace of his going. As in a daze, Cormac turned his steed and rode back across the trampled field, his horse's hoofs splashing in lakes of blood and clanged against the helmets of dead men. Across the valley, the shout of victory was thundering, yet all seemed shadowy and strange. A shape was striding across the torn corpses, and Cormac was dully aware that it was Bran. The Gael swung from his horse and fronted the king. Bran was weaponless and gory. Blood trickled from gashes on brow, breast and limb. What armour he had worn was clean hacked away, and a cut had shorn halfway through his iron crown. But the jewel still gleamed, unblemished like a star of slaughter.
"It is in my mind to slay you,"
said the Gael, heavily and like a man speaking in a daze.
"For the blood of brave men is on your head. Had you given the signal to charge sooner, some would have lived."
Bran folded his arms. His eyes were haunted.
"Strike if you will. I am sick of slaughter. It is a cold mead, this kinging it. A king must gamble with men's lives and naked swords. The lives of my people were at stake. I sacrificed the Northmen, yes. And my heart is sore within me, for they were men. But I had given the order. But had I given the order when you would have desired, all might have gone awry. The Romans were not yet amassed in the narrow mouth of the gorge, and might have had time and space to form their ranks again and beat us off. I waited until the last moment, and the rovers died. A king belongs to his people, and cannot let either his own feelings or the lives of men influence him. Now my people are saved, but my heart is cold in my breast."
Cormac wearily dropped his sword point to the ground.
"You're a born king of men, Bran," said the Gaelic prince. Bran's eyes roved the field. A mist of blood hovered over all, where the victorious barbarians were looting the dead, while those Romans who had escaped slaughter by throwing down their swords and now stood under guard looked on with hot, smouldering eyes. My kingdom, my people, are saved, said Bran wearily. They will come from the heather, by the thousands, and when Rome moves against us again, she will meet a solid nation. But I am weary. What of Cull?
My eyes and brain were mazed with battle,
answered Cormac.
I thought to see him vanish like a ghost into the sunset. I will seek his body.
Seek not for him, said Bran. Out of the sunrise he came. Into the sunset he is gone. Out of the mists of the ages he came to us. And back into the mists of the eons he has returned. To his own kingdom.
Cormac turned away. Night was gathering. Gunnar stood like a white spectre before him.
To his own kingdom,
echoed the wizard.
Time and space are not. Cull has returned to his own kingdom, his own crown, his own age. Then he was a ghost. Did you not feel the grip of his solid hand? Did you not hear his voice, see him eat and drink, laugh and slay and bleed?
Still Cormac stood like one in a trance.
Then if it be possible for a man to pass from one age into one yet unborn, or come forth from a century dead and forgotten, whichever you will, with his flesh and blood body and his arms, then he was as mortal as he was in his own day. Is Cull dead then? He died 100,000 years ago, as men reckon time,
answered the wizard.
But in his own age, he died not from the swords of the Gauls of this age. Have we not heard in legends how the king of Valusia travelled into a strange, timeless land of the misty future ages, and there fought in a great battle? Why, so he did, 100,000 years ago, or today. And 100,000 years ago, or a moment agone, Cull, king of Valusia, roused himself on the silken couch in his secret chamber, and laughing spoke to the first Gunnar, saying,
"Ha, wizard, I have in truth dreamed strangely, for I went into a far clime and a far time in my vision, and fought for the king of a strange shadow people."
And the great sorcerer smiled, and pointed silently at the red-notched sword, and the torn mail, and the many wounds the king carried. And Cull, fully awoken from his vision, and feeling the sting and the weakness of these yet bleeding wounds, fell silent and mazed, and all life and time and space seemed like a dream of ghosts to him, and he wondered thereat all the rest of his life. For the wisdom of the eternities is denied even unto princes, and Cull could no more understand what Gunnar told him than you can understand my words. And then Cull lived, despite of his many wounds,
said Cormac,
and has returned to the mists of silence and the centuries, Well, he thought us a dream, and we thought him a ghost. And sure, life is but a web spun of ghosts and dreams and illusion. And it is in my mind that the kingdom which has this day been born, of swords and slaughter in this howling valley, is a thing no more solid than the foam of the bright sea.
Thank you for listening. For updates, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Images courtesy of Unsplash.com. Audio courtesy of YouTube Audio Library. Links and artist creditation in the description. Please like, comment, share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell.